Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this regular Methodicon video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. And we're going to start things out with the alleged specifications of the PlayStation 5, which has popped up on the internets. The system, codenamed Ariel, is looking a beast if these alleged specifications are accurate. In fact, it may even edge the performance of Microsoft's Anaconda. Both Sony and Microsoft are almost certainly going to be using AMD's portfolio of hardware. Microsoft appeared alongside AMD at CES 2019 with Phil Spencer confirming that they are going to continue their relationship with AMD, which basically means that you are quite limited to the fact that, well, you're going to be using AMD's hardware, which almost certainly means we're going to see a Zen 2 based processor on the Xbox, and we're also going to see most likely a Navi-based GPU. And indeed, there has been some specifications for the Anaconda, which is the highest-end Xbox SKU, which have leaked out. We're going to compare that versus the specifications of the PS5 in just a moment. Sony, meanwhile, there have been multiple reports that they are going to be using a Zen-based processor, and also we've seen a Forbes article plus a couple of other websites have also reported that Sony were critical in the funding of Navi, although it's quite interesting that Microsoft are also going to be using Navi, allegedly. So I'll be interested in the backstory of that and how all of that's playing out behind the scenes. Regardless, on the website /forum Beyond 3D, a user who has been a member of the website for a couple of years, around 3 years-ish, has actually posted a list of alleged specifications for the upcoming PlayStation 5, once again codenamed Ariel. Now, I will say that Beyond 3D users have posted leaks before which have proven to be accurate, including the leak of the specifications for the Wii U. But obviously different users have different levels of access. So just because, user A posts something that turns out to be true doesn't mean that user B turns out to be accurate with their information. I do have a couple of issues with the specifications of this system. But we'll go into the specs first, and then I'll break down why I have some problems with it. So, first things first, let's read the intro. PS5 dev kits are in the wild, and I've got some good news for you. Systems will be revealed close to E3 2019 in Sony's special event, with some of the mind-blowing tech demos and a few megatons, and a release date of first quarter to second quarter of 2020. The Last of Us Part 2's motion matching in 4K 60 FPS is a joy to watch. Specs: 8 core, 16 threads at 3.2 GHz boost, and with a Zen 2 architecture, and according to him, this is the biggest improvement we've ever seen CPU-wise, even bigger than the PS2 to PS3. GPU is fully Navi-based, with some AMD's next-generation architecture, and features 12.6 to 14.2 GPU clocks still to be confirmed, 24 to 20 GB of GDDR6 at 880 gigabytes per second, 4 GB of DDR4 is reserved for the operating system, and 2 TB of hard drive space. So there are several issues I have with the specs, but also one of the key things you might have noticed is the release date. It's the first to second quarter of 2020, which would be an unusual launch date, but given we don't know when Microsoft are going to launch the Xbox, maybe Sony just want the system out as soon as possible. So that's certainly not a deal breaker. Let's look over the supposed specs of Anaconda. We are looking at a custom 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 part, Navi, 12 teraflop GPU, 16 GB of GDDR6 memory, bandwidth is not noted here, and a 1 TB NVMe drive. Now, the CPU clocks for Zen 2 I have absolutely no problems with. In fact, I always suspected it was going to be around the low 3 to possibly 3.5-ish gigahertz range for a Zen 2 CPU in a console. Because ultimately you have power constraints, you've got heat constraints, you need to make sure that you've got great yields and blah 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 blah. Also the fact that they're using Zen 2 and Navi and so on is not unsurprising. It's like if you task 2 teams of engineers and you say that, look, here are your constraints. You've got to make sure that the system is no more expensive than around $500 US, or, you know, we can make a small loss. So let's say the total cost is $550 to $600 per system shipped, because we can make up the difference in, let's say, install-based and people buying games and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, you're giving engineers a maximum cost of around $500 per system. Similarly, you're telling them it's got to operate within this power budget, it's got to be this size, and it also needs to be released by this date, because clearly they can't just choose hardware which isn't going to be ready for about 3 or 4 years' time. Most likely AMD have given them a lot of insight into upcoming products, including Arcturus, which is the successor to Navi, and clearly they need to then make a decision of, well, we can't wait for that long because this system's already this age and we know our competitor wants to get out this system. Nintendo Switch is doing X, so we just want a system by this point. So when you give two groups of engineers the same type of constraints, most likely they are going to stick with very similar hardware, particularly if you're using the same vendor to provide that hardware. So once again, the fact that we see a lot of crossover with the specs isn't particularly surprising. What does raise one of my eyebrows, though, is that they're telling us that it's the biggest CPU jump since the PlayStation 2 to PS3. The PS3's CPU was honestly quite monstrous. I've put out quite a number of videos regarding the architecture of the PlayStation 4, as well as the architecture of the PS4 versus the Xbox One, and also I did a post-mortem on the PS3's cell. You can check that out if you want. I'll try to remember to link it in the description. But the long and short of it is that the cell was an absolute beast when it launched, and the reality was that it had two different types of cores, and I say it in such a tone because I'm vastly simplifying it. It had a more traditional CPU core, but it also had cores which were almost like running compute. You could do physics tasks on them, and you could run like audio, and you could do like artificial intelligence, you could do graphics effects and so much other stuff. They were really powerful, but they were kind of difficult to use, and they were also rather expensive, that is the cell processor. But it was really monstrous, although to be fair, the PS2 CPU wasn't exactly a slouch. I will say that the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, both using the Jaguar CPUs, yeah, okay, they have some issues. There are 8 cores, although technically speaking, there's around 1.5-ish cores which are dedicated to the operating system, and they are run, depending on the device. The PS4 base runs at 1.6 GHz, with the Xbox One X having the fastest clock out of all of them at 2.3 GHz. And you can't just, of course, compare clock speed and the number of CPU cores, because Zen has SMT, which means you're running 2 threads per core, although it's not like double the scaling. Depending on the task, it can be around 1.5 times performance jump, so it's like saying almost 12 physical cores, although that's really not 100% accurate. Once again, depends on the task. But you also have significantly higher clock speeds with the Zen architecture, plus a much higher amount of IPC. In other words, the cores per clock, so not including the clock speed, but literally per clock cycle, are doing a lot more work. So without question, it is a significant jump, but I don't think it's the biggest jump by far compared to the PS2 to PS3 processors. Continuing though, let's look at the RAM situation. So they're saying that they're using GDDR6. I don't think that's particularly a big deal. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, because yes, GDDR6 is more expensive compared to GDDR5, but I imagine it would be the most sensible option for them. GDDR6 is available currently, at least from what we understand, available in 2 configurations. Not speeds withstanding here, it's available in 1 and 2 gigabyte modules. So each chip, in essence, is 1 to 2 gigabytes in capacity. So if you want to build a GPU, you could have like 4 chips at 1 gigabyte each, and that would mean there's 4 chips total. Or you could have 4 gigabytes with 2 chips, which of course would, once again, 2 times 2 is 4. The difference is though that the number of chips you have equates to the width of the bus. So each chip has a 32-bit memory interface. So if you have 4 chips, that's a 128-bit bus. So here's where the maths don't quite work. 12 times 32, he says as he's doing it live, is 384. So you've got a 384-bit memory bus. The fastest chips currently available are 16 Gbps. That's what's on the roadmap so far. So when you divide that 8 by 8 for the bits into bytes and all of that, it essentially means you're looking at around 100 gigabytes per second lower than what the alleged performance numbers are here. So even if they would have mistyped and said, well, it's 780 gigabytes per second, it still wouldn't have quite worked because it's 768. But the second thing is that it would have also been rather expensive for them to do this. The 4 gigabytes of DDR4 is also a bit weird. If you've got so much RAM, I'm not saying it's impossible. Sony did do this with the PlayStation 4 Pro. There is actually an amount of DDR3 memory on the system, and this is combined with the 8 gigabytes because they didn't actually increase the amount of GDDR5 memory on the system. They basically just changed how the allocation of that memory worked. So my personal opinion is that the specs of this system, this set of leaks anyway, is just not accurate. I think that the cost of this system in terms of the memory would just be prohibitive. I believe that the specs of the memory in terms of the bandwidth and so on is just not accurate. But that said, I do think that there are some elements of this that probably will turn out to be fairly accurate. I think we will see a CPU that is roughly clocked around the 3 to 3.5-ish gigahertz. I suspect it's going to be a Zen 2 architecture. It's almost certainly going to be 8 cores. I'm almost 100% certain it's going to be a NAPI-based GPU. Oh, and they also said there that it incorporates some features of the next generation architecture. The next generation architecture is Arcturus. If you're unfamiliar with AMD's GPU roadmap, currently we've got the Radeon 7 along with Polaris available for consumers. Radeon 7 is basically using Vega 7nm. The follow-up to that, which is suspected to launch around the first half of this year, so around July is what I keep being told for Navi, that is going to essentially be the GPU that's going to be featured in the next generation consoles. However, after that, around a year after that, we will see another GPU architecture from AMD known as Arcturus. Arcturus, we don't know too much about. However, there have been a couple of patents, and regular viewers will know about them because I've discussed them a number of times before. So, what essentially this leaker is saying here is that we are looking at features which have essentially found their way from Arcturus, and basically Sony are doing a custom GPU. To the leaker's credit, Sony have done this previously with the PlayStation 4 Pro, for example. What they did is they actually had a custom GPU, and they actually decided to request certain features for the PS4 Pro's GPU, which were found in Vega. So you had essentially a Polaris-based GPU in the PS4 Pro, but it did have some Vega features like rapid packed math, which allowed 2 16-bit floating point operations to run concurrently rather than just one 32-bit floating point operation. So I do think there are some elements of truth in terms of, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a rough spec that looked kind of similar to this, but I think that this particular leaker just kind of picked what sounded good and pretty much just matched what Sony have done in the past, picked what Microsoft have been doing with the Anaconda, and just tweaked the specs to make it sound a little bit more powerful than Microsoft's system. But that's not to say that Sony won't release a more powerful system than Microsoft, because ultimately we don't know anything at the moment, and so we're just going to have to wait. Watch this space. I also have a small update for you concerning the next generation CPUs on the desktop side of things from AMD. So, as regular viewers may know, I regularly correspond with folks on Twitter, including Jim and Adorned TV, and he and I regularly compare what our respective sources have been telling us. And there are a couple of things which have certainly raised both of our curiosity, because we both are almost certain, obviously we can't tell each other where our sources work and the names of them, but we are almost certain that we have two completely different sources. And interestingly, both of those sources have told us something which is almost verbatim identical, just worded slightly differently. My source told me, and this is a quote, that they are struggling between CPU performance and pricing to settle down position of each, but never say never, AMD are, quote, AMD. He was told, that is Jim, that they don't know how to segment it and are still deciding on how to keep the momentum going over the year. Now, what this basically means is that for AMD, one of the key things that they are supposedly struggling with internally is maintaining that press enthusiasm, right? Because when you just launch all of your products at once, the issue then becomes, it's like, well, how do we continue that press cycle of of making people excited that more things are being launched? That's one of the reasons, not certainly the only reason, but one of the reasons we see staggered launches. So supposedly, one of the issues that AMD are struggling with right now is whether they should delay a 16-core processor. I've actually been told that by a couple of different people, that they are actually considering delaying the 16-core CPUs. In fact, I've reported that as well last week, if memory serves. And basically, it's just going to be a really interesting next several months. And I say several months because I wouldn't be surprised if AMD decide to continuously put out different processors and possibly even performance update patches and all the other bits and bobs that we've seen previously. Sticking with the subject of CPUs, we also have some news from Camp Intel, and that concerns Cascade Lake and Cascade Lake X, with the latter being the part that I suspect most of us are going to be interested in because it is essentially the successor to Skylake X. So, this leak comes to us from Chip Hell and also Twitter user Momo. And what we see here is we're going to see a launch of Cascade Lake taking place in April, with Cascade Lake X taking place in June, most likely around Computex. Now this is really interesting because it's still going to be a 14nm process part, but we should see significantly higher clock speeds plus some other architectural changes and improvements, especially when it comes to core count. Intel clearly are also facing the pressure, or at least will be facing a lot of pressure from AMD. AMD have confirmed, although we all knew it, so I don't know why anyone was raising an eyebrow when they confirmed that Threadripper 3000 was indeed a thing. And that, from what I'm being told, is going to launch around the third-ish quarter. There's not an exact release date yet, though, for that, that I've been told anyway. So clearly, what Intel want to do is put out their parts first. And it also might help take some of the excitement away from people who are looking to buy a Matisse part. Although, of course, the pricing from a HEDT system, along with, let's say, a mainstream system, are very different. But still, it does, you've got a product out there and it once again eats up some news cycles, which is certainly not a negative thing. And finally, we have a leak for the GTX 1660 non-TI. This is a benchmark from Ashes of the Singularity. I don't know why that particular database is always rife with benchmarks, but there you go. Unfortunately, it's never the most consistent benchmark out there, but the user term AppySac has actually a couple of benchmarks that we compare this with the GTX 1660 Ti as well as the GTX 1060. So how does the 1660 non-Ti compare? Well, the answer is pretty darn favourably. The 1660 scores around 5700 points compared to the 1660 Ti, which scores 6300 points. So around 600 points difference between the two. And we also see an almost identical difference between the 1660 and the GTX 1060 as well, with 500 points difference. So essentially the 1660 is going to be almost like a GTX 1065 or a GTX 1060 Ti almost, at least in this one particular benchmark. I do actually think that this card could be really interesting because yes, there is a small cut to the number of CUDA cores, but the biggest difference is the memory configuration, with obviously using GDDR5. With that said, if you're quite lucky with the Silicon Lottery, in other words, what parts, or rather what modules that they're opting to use on your particular GPU, and you get really lucky with the cooling and just, lucky in general, you might be able to crank the clocks up enough to make up some of the difference. Of course, you can overclock the TI variant as well, but still, if you can overclock these cards okay in terms of the DRAM, I'm not saying that it's going to be as fast as the 1660 Ti, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's, kind of getting up there. And this could be an excellent part for people who are on a tight budget and looking to spend around the $200 mark. It also means it essentially outprices and outperforms what AMD can put out right now with, let's say, the 570 and the 580. But as we all know, Navi won't be too long, so hopefully that's going to be a really good thing as well. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, then definitely consider clicking the like button and subscribing and clicking the bell icon so that YouTube really knows that you want to subscribe. You can also find us down on social medias, which is of course linked in the description of this very video. And you can also find Amazon affiliate links if you decide to help out the channel, or Patreon as well, which is linked in the video description. Once again, don't feel you have to, but even $1 a month does help us to buy new equipment and just, helps us produce new content for you. With all of that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.